All right, you are listening to The Audit presented by IT Audit Labs. I'm Joshua Schmidt, your co-host and producer. Today we're joined by Nick Mellem and Eric Brown of IT Audit Labs. And our guest today is Dino Busalachi. He is currently in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's coming to us today to talk about OT IT Convergence. And Dino, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I know this isn't your first podcast, but we're excited to talk about a topic that you're familiar with today, that OT meets IT and a lot of other things that go hand in glove with that. So thanks for joining us. Can you give us a little background? You have so many titles here on LinkedIn, I didn't know where to start. So I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, that comes with the gray hair, right? So I'm currently a director here at the Barry Windmiller Design Group. The Design Group is a manufacturing engineering organization, been around for 100 years, and they acquired my firm last year. So I've been at the Design Group now since July of 2024. Prior to that, I owned and operated an OT cybersecurity systems integration company. Focused just with these OT cybersecurities. Prior to that, I spent several years working for Rockwell Automation in their network security services group. Prior to that, I was in the Rockwell channel working with their distributors, a lot of system integrators and OEMs, and I'll touch a little bit on that. Then prior to that, I spent 20 years working for one of the world's largest adult beverage manufacturers based out of St. Louis. You can probably guess who that is. Working, building out Breweries of the future. And so I spent a lot of time around control systems, implementing what I want to call IT technologies on the plant floor, which is why when I was at Rockwell, when some of these OT cybersecurity technologies started coming to the market, I knew there was a niche in driving cybersecurity down on that plant floor. The myth of those machines being air-gapped, it just doesn't exist anymore. Prior to that, I worked for General Motors under Ross Perot. Back in the 80s, I worked for Monsanto and various others. I actually started in the banking industry in the early 80s, working in data centers and got involved with building out networks to banks and putting in ATM machines back in the day when the ATM machine was actually at the bank. So that's a condensed version of my background.
Wow. That's awesome. Do you get a lifetime supply of free beer then? Does that come along with the territory?
If you know the right people, the answer is yes.
One of the things that stuck with me is you shared that manufacturing is one of the largest attack vectors, and maybe you could explain why that is and how that is met with your experience working in OT.
Attacking a manufacturing facility and getting to the point where you got a material breach and you're able to shut down that plant is very costly, right? So when I worked for that large adult beverage manufacturer, if we just had one packaging line not putting beer in a can or a bottle, that was $80,000 an hour in loss, right? And so when you think about a manufacturing environment, you know, that's their plants aren't operating, it gets very expensive very quickly, right? And cybersecurity insurance doesn't cover business disruption, right? It'll cover the aspects of doing the remediation and mitigation work that you gotta do, but they're not going to pay for the loss that you incurred from being down.
So then, Dino, probably the most famous example of that air gap breach, so to speak, is probably Stuxnet, right? With the sandworm. So in your experience, how did you have you seen other attacks like that when you were working at those previous organizations, and how did you combat it?
Not that targeted. I mean, that was a highly specialized, developed malware, attacking a specific Siemens set of control systems that whatever nation states were involved with it had inherent knowledge of what they were using within that nuclear facility. But what I will say is that a lot of the manufacturing environments are impacted by breaches that come through the IT environment, right? Because we use a lot of the same technologies on the plant floor that you have in the enterprise or in the office space, right? Windows, for example, that are running HMIs, your human machine interfaces, your historians, your application servers, your engineering programming terminals. Those are all Windows machines. And then you also have a lot of networking equipment out there too, right? You got all stripes and types out there inside that manufacturing facility. So, and they all have vulnerabilities. So if you're accustomed and used to what I still call Patch Tuesday for Microsoft, right? We don't patch very often on the plant floor because it's very disruptive. The life cycle of control systems is measured in decades, right? It's not measured in a 3 to 5 or 7 year window. So when control systems, you're putting in a $20 million packaging line, the intent is that packaging line is going to be out there for 20 years doing what it does, right? And even then, the frames of that equipment may still remain the same, but you might do a recontrol, right? And recontrol efforts, that means that you're replacing the PLCs, you're replacing the SCADA software, you might be doing some upgrade on the applications, maybe the network. It's very, very costly, right? And those are usually capital projects. They're not OpEx projects, they're capital projects. And so the dynamics are different in that particular space. And if you're buying from an OEM, right, they may not stay as current on patching for their control systems.
That was going to be one of my questions. You pretty much illustrated it, but for the people that aren't, familiar with manufacturing environments or maybe just, are tuning in for the tech aspects of this show, can you give us kind of a general sense of what these manufacturing floors look like?
Yeah, and it's significant, right? When you think about the number of, you've probably heard the term IoT or IIoT for the industrial Internet of Things. We obviously have the term OT, but yeah, when you think about motors and drives and robots and pumps and sensors and fillers and conveyors and just the presses and all, dryers and fans, I can go on and on and on, and all of the different types of connected physical systems. That's what we kind of call them. I think of connected physical systems. And in the IT world, you have data driving data outcomes, right? In the OT world, you got data driving physical outcomes. And so, the two priorities in any manufacturing facility, safety is always job one, right? There's no doubt about that. You got to operate safe, and it's non-negotiable, right? So you have to be a safe environment. You have to demonstrate that you're doing it. Number two is what I spoke about earlier, is unplanned, unscheduled downtime, because it's expensive and it's costly to demonstrate what the target is for this. Right, because it's usually not in their purview, meaning that IT doesn't own those assets. Nowhere else in the business, especially on the enterprise side, IT has a responsibility of the technology that the company is using to run their business, right? But on the OT side, it's not so much. The decision to put in a new packaging line and what's going to consist on the control systems around that packaging line, and what computers are we going to choose, and what networking equipment are we going to choose, and operating systems and firmware and applications, it's an entirely different group of people, right? So when I worked at Rockwell, even when I worked for Anheuser-Busch, IT wasn't sitting in the room when we were getting ready to determine, to build a new brew house for $500 million.
Should they have been sitting in the room?
Ideally, Eric, yes. We want that, yes. Here's the way I kind of describe it, Eric. I want them on the field. I want them in the huddle. They just can't be the quarterback. If that makes sense, right?
Sure.
But yeah, they play a tremendous role, right? Governance, policy, technology, resources, standards. They bring a lot to the table. But they're not always invited in through that CapEx project on whatever it is that company's, doing an expansion, brownfield, greenfield, lifecycle replacement, whatever to recontrol, whatever tech project they're taking on. We don't typically see IT sitting in the room participating, in something that might start 2 years prior to that machine being built and running. And I'll give you another good example, Eric. We were just in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, and the client, the IT, the networking team came on site and met us there. They were 20 minutes from this plant. And out of the 3 IT professionals out of this company, only one of them had been to the plant in the last 5 years. The other 2 had never been there. So, it's very difficult from an IT perspective, if you're not engaged in what's going on in that plant operationally, from a process perspective, what technologies are in there. It's very difficult for you to start putting a cybersecurity strategy around that, right? You got to think globally, but you got to act locally. And if you got 50 plants in your fleet, no 2 are the same. And so you have to have some inherent knowledge of what's going on inside that facility and what technologies do they have in there and how that stuff is put together.
Dino, we're seeing this too, that IT is not invited to the party. I guess in your opinion, especially in your industry. Why do you think that is? Why are they being left out of these meetings that are even if they're happening 2 years beforehand? Why are they not being invited, in your opinion?
Yeah, good question. It's one of the things that we look at when we start these engagement is we look at the organization. And sometimes the first time that IT and OT have the same manager, leader, is usually at the president or the CEO of the company. Think about that for a second, right? And that's not necessarily right either, right? And then when you have to think about the size and the scope of how many people you need. So if you're a CIO, and let's say you got 200 people working for you, right? And you've got 100 plants. Well, how big is that OT practice need to be from a technology standpoint? And who's going to own that, right? Is it going to be the CIO? Is the CIO going to become the new plant manager or general manager of the plant? Because they operate as fiefdoms. These plants do their own little kingdom, meaning they decide who they're going to work with from an integrator perspective, or whose machines they're going to buy, what their partner community is on the OT ecosystem, as I call it, right? And the OT side is not any better, right? The OT ecosystem, that supply chain on that side of the house, needs to get better at this, right? Because if you go in there and start talking to them about cybersecurity, who do you think they're going to point their fingers at and says responsible for cybersecurity? That's IT. They're going to come, that's IT's problem, right? And then we show these machine centers, and IT sitting in the room, and they're going, yeah, that's not us. I don't even know what that stuff is, right? And so there's a gap.
We see it a lot where we'll go in to help an organization maybe restructure how they're doing information security because they're at an inflection point, right? Whatever that is. And a lot of these organizations have multiple disciplines of OT, whether it's around transportation or refuse or control systems that are doing something related to critical infrastructure. And I don't think I've gone into an organization yet that has had what I would call even a standard plan for how they're going to operate and secure the technology that the plant is responsible for. Like at the end of the day, don't really care what's in the plant, what the plant does, but it's about how are those systems that are operating that equipment being secured. And like you said, there's communication happening outside of that quote unquote closed network. I don't think I've ever seen truly closed network yet either. And I've been doing this a while, but yet there's, some of them are museum pieces. You go in there and there's Windows XP, there's Windows 7, there's all of these they're desktop applications that for whatever reason these OT organizations have decided to run their infrastructure on. See very little Unix, Linux flavors. It's a lot of Windows flavors and a lot of legacy Windows flavors. And you mentioned tools like Dragos or specific to OT that can help look passively for that, for things going on that network, which, in some cases, when the horsepower around the technology was smaller or there was less horsepower available to do non-ILC processing, then nowadays, though, there's technology that could sit quietly on the network, could look, decrypt, whatever, for things that might be calling out or attempting to call out or attempting to move laterally. And unless that OT part of the organization is bringing apart the discipline, which it's really hard to have the discipline to know how to run, a tier one cybersecurity shop and run a plant that is responsible for operating that line of business. It's really hard to do both. So you've got to kind of outsource the IT side to either internal IT or a third party to bring about that best practice and facilitate it. And I don't think it's acceptable to say, yeah, it's okay to run on 20-year-old technology just because the plant itself is running on old technology because it can last 20, 30 years. Those manufacturers need to be held accountable to bringing the technology along. It's not a secret. We all know that Windows expires over time, and we've got to stay on top of it. So bringing governance in early into that 2-year process at the contract level to hold the vendor accountable for making sure that those updates, there is at least a vehicle to do the updates, that's kind of where I am now in my headspace versus saying, oh, it's an OT environment, let's just leave it, let it run, and hope nothing happens.
Yeah. Well, and the way what you're describing is very expensive, right?
Sure.
To replace, to move from Windows 7 or XP and do a recontrol or maybe move a piece of equipment, you might be talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in order to do that, right? And so there has to be, the client has to recognize that. Where are you, right? Because right now they don't even have a really good idea where they are. They don't have a good baseline. So you got to get that figured out first. And there are technologies to help through that while they're building their capital plan, Eric, to your point, to be able to go after that stuff, like virtual patching, right? Or defensible architectures around that machine center so that you can at least improve your cybersecurity posture, harden it, while you're putting together that multi-million-dollar CapEx plan to go after and replace that. The other thing that I'll tell you is that I call it the OEM blockade. They won't let you touch their stuff, right? If you want their support and you want the warranty and maintenance that comes with that machine center, they don't want you touching it, right? And because otherwise you avoid the warranty. So think about if you bought a car and you're getting the warranty and support from GM, and then you go in there and you modify the exhaust system, and you decide to swap out the transmission, and you try to maybe do something with fuel injection, and you modify it, and then you take it back to GM to say fix it. They're going to go no, right? And these OEMs have that mindset because they don't even understand that even if we just want to put something in there as simple as a sensor, right, to collect the metadata within that control system, they would say if you touch that, if you add anything to that switch to do that or change the configuration of that switch to create a span port to pull that stuff out of there, you void the warranty. And a lot of the clients are like, they don't want to buck the system with that OEM. And so now you got to get ahead of the game, right? Now you got to be proactive. And so if you're going to buy a new piece of equipment, then you need to, and let's say you're a Drago shop or an Armis shop or a Clarity shop, you should be planning ahead to put in the right technology in that machine center, right? I always like using the automobiles, right? You don't put the seat belts on after the fact, or the anti-lock brakes on after the fact, or the sensors or the backup cameras, the airbags. You do it when you're building the car, right? And it's the same concept, which is one of the other big disconnects that we see is those OEMs and a lot of these system integrators, of which the firm I work for is both of those, trying to change that narrative in the machines and the integrations that you're doing and implementing that up front, right? It's much more cost effective to do it then than it is to do it on the retro on the backside. So two things, it can be expensive to try to do a recontrol, replace equipment, and then you got to deal with the OEM that can be a little pig-headed sometimes, right? And you got to try to break through that.
There's a lot of moving parts here. I'm thinking back to one of my first IT jobs, relatively not that long ago, 10, 12 years ago. And it was at a large manufacturing company in the Twin Cities. And being a junior IT, I was on the help desk there, and I'd run out and help, all these different lines get back up that were going down or do any sort of tasks. But there we had so much legacy software. And I'll never forget one of the more senior guys, I was out running tasks with him, and we had one machine over in this corner. I don't remember what it was doing. I think it was printing labels or something. And he said, we don't touch that thing because if it turns off, it might not ever come back on. It had been there for maybe 30 years, out of support, obviously legacy software. The vendor doesn't even exist anymore. But it was always so confusing to me. Why don't we just change it out? And I'm hearing from you now, just the expense to it. But, is it a lack of auditing? Are we not asking these questions? Is that the root problem? Are we not, as IT professionals, are we not digging into the sand, letting them know these issues? Or, I guess my question is, are we going wrong somewhere, or is it just because we're not invited to the table, is my earlier question. But it's happening so often that we're inviting the wolf into the hen house. not being compliant or having these discussions that we're having now, which it seems like we're all on the same page. But it seems from a simple discussion earlier on, like you said, putting the seatbelts in early, we could solve a lot of these problems down the road.
It's the timing of it, in my view, right? How do you, IT, is how do you get that IT group engaged and involved in that OT environment, right, and become part of that ecosystem? What makes the most sense, right? So think of shadow IT, right? Eric, I know you know what that is. You've been we go back a number of years, right? And that was one of the things we were trying to chase out was shadow IT. But when it comes to that plant floor, it's the one area that they've just never been able to take on. And a lot of it is because they don't own the asset, right? Who owns that asset? Like I said earlier, all of the enterprise stuff, there's no question. It's IT. They own that, right? They make those decisions, whether they're using third parties or it's an internal team or a mixture of both. But at the end of the day, they make those decisions. They make those buying decisions. They decide the resources and the responsibility to take care of it, just like that OEM does on the plant floor. But when it comes to that PLC, it's a programmable logic controller, right? And so that's the instrument, and it's usually running on a Linux-based operating system of some sort, right? It's not running on a Windows OS. It's usually a Linux type of OS. But it's the one that's receiving signals and making calls to make that motor go faster, or to turn the flames up on that burner, or to speed up that filler, or whatever that might be. That's what that controller is doing, right? And IT they've never put their hands on it, even to the extent that engineering teams would design their control system architecture to put multiple network cards into that PLC to make it a network segmentation device. Because one side, if you're familiar with the Purdue model, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Purdue model, but think of a PLC with an Ethernet card on it because we want information sent to our historian, we need remote access to it for programming, and I want to send data up to my MES. And so there's a connection to what I want to call the enterprise side of the network. Because even though it's within the plant, it's the side of the network that IT usually manages. But then there's other cards in there for control that are on that PLC, and that's the space that you never, ever find IT in, because that's actual control. That's the one that's sending the signals, because we're back to process integrity and we're back to safety. And if you don't understand what that thing is doing, it's very hard for you to take on a role of trying to, I call it the round peg square hole, and applying a security measures in there that could be disruptive to that environment. How are you going to get a group with the boots on the ground knowledge of what's going in there to implement? All right, I got Siemens over here, I got Rockwell over there, I got Honeywell, I got GE, I got Emerson, I got Yasago, I got Mitsubishi. They're not very standardized, right? IT's done a really good job of standardizing everything, right? Compute platform, network platform, databases, ERP systems. They've standardized. You get into that plant and it's 7 ways to Sunday in there. I'll find 8 different access methods into the plant for remote access. And I'll find several different automation technology vendors in that one facility.
One thing you said that stood out to me, Dino, is that even just within a company, the plants are vastly different from location to location as well. Not just, the equipment that's running in them and how they get things done and where they're positioned and all that, but yeah, the whole layout, the design.
And culturally and behaviorally, I mean, depending on what part of the world they're in or what part of even of this country they're in, you have different mindsets on how they operate that are tough to get through. And then you have a lot of mergers and acquisitions. A lot of these plants, that have been bought and sold multiple times over the last 30 or 40 years, and you just don't have a lot of good continuity. And the way we pick up on that really quickly is lack of documentation. Mm-hmm. They don't know what they got. There's no network drawings. There's no good network drawings. Whatever documentation they have, 20, 30, 40% of it's wrong. It hasn't been marked up. Can't find it, don't have it. Right. So we do a lot of, investigating and hunting when we're in there trying to determine, we go in there and drop one of these tools in to start, collecting a baseline. And then we walk the plant and we open up those panel doors to see what's in there. And we document that. So I want to be able to reconcile what did I visually see on the plant floor, and it's not in my baseline on my tool. So I can figure out how do I get that system over here on this box, right? and make those determinations of whether I got to put a sensor out there, or I got to change the network to some extent. They even have cabling to get me out there, right? So and so it's the dynamic of it, aspect of it is what's can be challenging, right? And not everybody's prepared. They're behind. They're 20 years behind IT on cybersecurity. 20 years. So then you get back to the IT conversation. So how do you get IT to drive that? Because IT's probably got an IR plan, and they probably practice it. I mean, I can remember the IR plans, back in the day where you'd run off to some third party site to spin up your business somewhere else, right? But in a plant, their only option is to either move their volumes to other facilities to make up for the loss of this one if it's not up and running, right? But they don't have one. And I will tell you that if I go into 10 plants, two of them are going to have malware in them. Every one of them is going to have a rogue asset or a series of rogue assets in them. Even the guy that's been there for 20 years, and we're telling him, hey, there's a WAP sitting over here on your packaging line. He goes, no, there's not. It's like, yes, there is. We could see it. It's on the network. Let's go hunt it down and find it. And they have no idea how it got there. We found stuff in ceiling tiles in plants that somebody put in there. There's all kinds of goofy things and they don't even know that.
It was probably the server guy wearing Umbros.
But just to give you an idea, between Gartner and Cisco and Rockwell and Siemens and these OT IDS guys, 60% of manufacturers out there are they're either unaware or just beginning to understand that OT is a thing. That's 60%. You got 30% that have actually started doing something. Maybe they did a POC, maybe they've had some demo, somebody came in and started talking about it. Maybe they've actually got a couple of people within their organization have been tasked with cybersecurity for the plant floors. And then you have 10% that actually have a strategy and a plan or starting to implement it and going down the line. That's where we are today.
I wanted to circle back really quick and kind of get Eric's take on, just integrating the IT in any kind of organization, but more specifically, bigger manufacturing or larger entities like Dino's talking about. Do you think it's mostly, what's your take on that? Is it mostly just kind of just a knowledge base or just a cultural thing of why there's a disconnect there? And I know you spend a lot of time on boards and things like that, showing people what the risk actually is, because, no one really sees it until it happens. So I was kind of curious to see what you thought about that.
I've seen a couple of cases where, more than a couple, and Dino alluded to this, where the IT organization or the leadership of the IT organization has never actually been into the plant. Maybe they've toured the plant, been on the grounds, but never really looked at the technology in the plant. And as Dino was telling the story about rogue devices or potentially malware in the systems, I've walked these plants or these operations, and we ought to do a picture slideshow on this, because there's just some crazy pictures where it's in a hospital, and the amount of cabling that was just across the face of the rack probably weighed more than me. It was just this huge rat's nest, and there was dead switches that had just been cabled around that were in that environment. There was dead rodents that were completely squished underneath a piece of technology that hadn't been moved in 10 years. It was way up in the rafters in this production facility that is responsible for making gift cards. And we were doing this network assessment, and we were kind of tracing back where we were seeing devices on the network, but we couldn't find them. And way up in the rafters on top of an I-beam was like some form of a Linksys device that was cabled into the network. There's no documentation, of course, on it. Nobody knew how it got there or what it was for, or if they were trying to add a new machine that they had long since taken out and forgot about. But the amount of undocumented technology that sometimes people that have been around the plant for years, they may remember, or might be some tribal knowledge. But I think part of it, Josh, is if you're responsible for an environment, or you're providing some form of responsibility, on the technology side, you got to know what's in your environment, right? Back to that CIS 1 and 2. Know what the hardware is in the environment, know what the software is in the environment. Because if you don't know what's out there, you really can't even begin to try to protect it.
Yeah. That's the first tenet in any cybersecurity framework, is that right there. Your asset inventory.
Yeah.
Question is whether you want to get it in a continuous fashion, like IT generally does, is collecting information, consistently, constantly, versus a snapshot in time. But that's the number one tenet in any security framework, is asset inventory, even to the point where critical infrastructure organizations, where the TSA and Department of Homeland Security are coming to them, and even now insurance. Now the insurance companies are coming in because they're getting smarter, going, you need an accurate asset inventory, and I want to know the vulnerabilities and risk associated with those things. That's the first thing, right? Before you get into anything else, let's just do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Bringing it back to the kind of the first question I asked at the beginning of the podcast about attack vectors, I think we've thoroughly kind of map the landscape of how things are a bit disjointed. Maybe, Dino, you could speak to why that is on just a practical level, maybe coming from the hacker or malicious actor side of things. Why is this such a prime target, manufacturing? Because
they'll pay. That manufacturer will write a check and get it paid to get back up and running. Those that don't will spend months and months and lose hundreds of millions of dollars trying to unwind whatever got in there. Those that don't have the wherewithal, skill, resources to deal with it will just write a check.
And that goes back to your earlier point about the amount of money being lost per hour on the manufacturing floor. And are you seeing just a lot? Is that just a lot of malware? Is there the ransomware and things of that nature, or what's the most common?
Yeah, malware that comes in, ransomware that makes its way in through some email system that gets its hands on those HMIs out there on the plant floor, because the HMI, that is a human machine interface, and if you can't gain access to that, then you're blind to whatever the machine's doing. You can't control it, so you have to shut it down.
And who's typically catching those things?
Well, if you got a Clarity in the environment or an Armis in the environment, it's going to catch it on that side of the fence, or IT may have caught it on their side. So think of Colonial Pipeline, right? You guys are probably familiar with Colonial Pipeline. In their particular case, when it came into their environment, the reason why they shut down on their side, on the moving of the fuel side, on the plant side, because they had no visibility. They didn't know whether they were safe or not, and because they're moving, petrol, gasoline, and diesel, and all kinds of stuff over 5,500 miles of pipe, they shut down on precaution because they didn't know the extent of the breach. They had no idea. If you look at Clorox, they decided to fight it themselves, and they lost several hundreds of millions of dollars trying to eradicate it themselves. I've got clients that have been fighting stuff on their plant floor for almost coming up on 2 years, right? Because they're trying to get it themselves and try to eradicate it, and then you have those that'll write the check. But getting back to what Eric said at the very beginning, in regards to something like Stuxnet, that was a very targeted control system. There's been a couple others. There's one at Saudi Aramco had one. It was Red Typhoon or something like that. It was targeting control systems. We don't see a lot of that as much as we see the malware that's hitting the Windows system that bleeds over into the plant floor where you have Windows tools, right? Windows systems. But it doesn't mean that, they're not out there. They are. It's just a lot of them's not even advertised. You got clients out there that just keep it quiet and find it themselves.
So we've touched on it briefly, and as we're looking to wrap up this awesome conversation, I'm just wondering, as we look to the future, what are some quick ideas or bullet point thoughts that how we can improve upon this in the future going forward, both from the OT and the IT side?
Well, obviously you want it to be collaborative, right? You want IT and OT to be aligned and collaborative and recognize each other's weaknesses in regards to dealing with this problem. You're probably going to need a third party to come in and help you with some of that. And you got to bring in a security framework. You need to pick one, whatever it is. If it's specific to your vertical, if you're in critical infrastructure and IEC 62443 and NERC CIP or it, then, adhere to that, right? And a lot of regulatory stuff's making you do that anyway. But you need to get a framework in place And you need to get the right tools, and you got to bring the right people to the table, right? And you need to have people that have experience doing this. It's surprising to me how many people just try to fight through it themselves. And, I saw Gartner came out with a report at the end of this year that said by 2027, was it a third or 25% of the cybersecurity professionals out there are just going to quit and go do something else? That'd be my choice.
How come? Did it say why?
Because of the stress, and it's just too difficult, If you're a CISO, the average tenure of a CISO is like less than 2 years, something like that.
We better get our rakes. We got a lot of work to do when that comes up.
I thought you were going to say they were going to work on their golf game, but Eric, how about you? Yeah.
So I think it's the organization's understanding that they can't do it themselves. And, Dino, you alluded to a couple of customers that you'd worked with that were trying to do the cleanup on their own. A lot of the customers that we've gone into recently kind of had this, I don't want to call it an anti-contractor mindset, but it's almost like the us and them of like the internal full-time employee staff versus the contractors, who the contractors are essentially, they're just paid out of a different bucket. So why do you care how they're paid if they're there to help you? And I apply it to a hospital model. You're sick. You go to the hospital. The ER doctor is not an employee of that hospital. The ambulance that brought you there is not an employee of that hospital. The anesthesiologist that is making sure you're comfortable while you're under surgery, if you have to go through that, is not an employee of that hospital. That cardiologist that's taking care of you is not an employee of that hospital. So I look at organizations that have been running, fat, dumb, and happy. They have an inflection point. They need to bring in some outside assistance to help them get better, to help them operationalize and continue to run their business. But really looking at those third-party contractors as people that are really specialized in an area that can come in and are honestly going to be able to help you faster than you could go out and try to staff it on your own. You're going to have to rely on that external assistance, and you're going to have to pay for it. So that's where I think there is no free lunch in this whole cybersecurity and even IT game that we're in, right? It's you just understand what you need to run your business, and if you don't have it internally, look externally.
Yeah, and the plant floor is not very much different than what you just described, Eric, because a lot of them don't have their own engineering teams. They don't build those machines, right? If you want a packaging line, they don't engineer and build that packaging line. They go out there and get the 3 or 4 or 5 different groups together to build that packaging line and the engineering teams to do that, right? It's the same concept, just different. But yeah, that's why you end up with a lot of different components on the plant floor of Siemens and Rockwell and Honeywell and, Hirschman switches versus Cisco switches versus, Phoenix Contacts or Red Lines or whatever, because of the different groups that are building that equipment and just bringing it into your plant. So it's a very similar analogy that he gave, but that's the plant floor. And IT is very standardized, right? They think that they can standardize everything, and they're just accustomed to working from that premise, and you're just not going to get that on the plant floor. Sorry, it's not that way, especially when you got 10,000 assets out there, right? And just one plant. You got 10,000 assets managed by, gosh, who knows who.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, Dino. It's been a great conversation. It's been very informative. Yeah. Thanks for being our guest. I'm going to wrap it up here, guys, and then we can debrief, and if you'd like. You've been listening to The Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs. My name is Joshua Schmidt, your co-host and producer. Today, our guest has been Dino Busalachi, and he was speaking about OT and IT and the convergence with Nick Mellem and Eric Brown from IT Audit Labs. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you source your podcasts. We have video every 2 weeks on YouTube and Spotify, and we'll see you in a couple days. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have a moment, leave us a comment on a YouTube channel or give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.